all our speakers are back, and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, Grant, I'm going to go ahead and pass this first one to you since you just went. Ava posted, can't you make 2 selections initially so that you have a backup species to avoid some of the headaches? Well, I perceived as headaches and, kind of having to go through that list. So are there strategies that you can employ to kind of get around when you can't find trees that match what you're looking for?
I mean, we certainly do that. And a lot of times, at least when I do my design work, I come up with kind of a whole suite of options that might be available and kind of work my way through them. I work in an office of 200 people, probably 20 of which are landscape architects. So my approach may be different than my neighbors. But, I think the challenges that we face are, not specific to a firm, and they're kind of our segment of what we do.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Leon, I have one from you, for you, coming from Matthew. How did you make the determination of which species were suitable in those lists you provided? I know you touched on them a little bit, and were growers a part of that discussion? Could you kind of touch on both of those?
So that research project was actually conducted by the University of Maryland Extension. So they really took the lead on that. I don't know if we still have Karen on the call.
I saw her pop in.
Yes, if she is, she can probably speak to that better than I can. But she developed these really wonderful tools that started with just native trees and then created all sorts of ways to screen for them in terms of which one had their canopy height, where there were optimal locations that they'd be optimal for. So she developed all these tools, and I think somebody put a link to her work in the chat. And we've been, it's been a great partnership to work with the University of Maryland Extension because they provide a lot of that expertise about species, which then we as the funder sort of play a middle role to connect that expertise to growers and to the grantee community. And I do believe growers have been involved in the research initiatives that she has been leading.
So I do see Karen in there in the chat, but I have no idea what she's doing. Otherwise, we could try to tap her in to offer her thoughts. But one that, maybe you all could speak on, Leon, I'll start with you, but are there any protocols in place or any guidance in place to kind of touch on some of these lists that get developed over a certain period of time? So after 5 years, we're going to, go back and reevaluate what that list looks like, or any temporal aspect that you're aware of to how these lists get revisited. Yeah.
I'll pass the mic to Karen, whose hand is now raised and is maybe able to speak.
I think I can maybe. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm glad. Just grabbed the first Karen I saw and made you presenter, so I'm glad it's the right one.
Okay. Yeah, so I can speak to a little bit of both the list development, but then also this agreement and opportunity kind of list. And I would say that our challenge coming in was that we were specifically trying to work with native trees. So there were a lot of lists that were already out there, but they weren't focused on kind of the native species. And then we didn't have a lot of information on which urban type spaces they would grow in. So we compiled things from about 12 different resources that of experts on whether they would grow well in urban areas, but then we also talked to folks in DC and Baltimore and got information from planters on their experience with species. So that all played in the initial list. In terms of the agreement and opportunity species, that was, we had both growers, nursery growers and planters kind of in the room during this process. And so we specifically talked to growers about what species they would like to grow, but they didn't have any evidence that people would buy them. So we kind of had a number of people in a working group that got put together after the legislation passed that were part of nursery industry and interviewed them. It was in a pretty informalized way because we were trying to, as quickly as possible, generate lists for Chesapeake Bay Trust. So it happened through both written questionnaires about species and then also through kind of working group conversations where I just took notes about particular species. So yes, both growers and planters were involved in that process, but it was interesting to see their different perspectives on the different tree species.
So Karen, are there any plans to go back and reevaluate the list after a given amount of time?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways to think about approaching that, and I would love to hear other people's perspective. I mean, obviously it takes time and resources to do a lot of these things. This became kind of like a COVID project almost in 2021 because we were all sort of stuck at home, and we could go through books and transfer information from some of these DER resources on tree species and things. What we are trying to do now is actually do on-the-ground research in Baltimore to evaluate some of the species. So some of these species that are predicted to do well in urban environments by experts, we want to kind of figure out how well they're doing. So our lab is actually going and doing health assessments on a lot of these species, trying to figure out if climate projections are accurate about which species are doing well. Updating the list, I have kind of gotten information and from people, like people will send me something being like, we think this species is available now in the industry. And so I will update that information, but it's a little bit ad hoc. And then I will say that from an extension standpoint, if we get more information on a disease or something that's coming in, we'll kind of assess whether to leave that on the list or not. So a good example right now is beech leaf disease, which is having a large effect. And we're trying to figure out like how much of a problem is this for potentially recommending planting beech in urban areas. So yes, I think we need to think about how to update these things because clearly, like Grant Thompson was just talking about, these lists matter. Because they can be used to create kind of code regulations and things. And we want to make those expansive, but also make them user friendly. And that's the balance that you run into when you're trying to generate these lists.
Grant or Trinity, any thoughts on let's see, exactly determining the species that are suitable or updating those lists? I know, Grant, you showed some lists with Iowa. Any awareness of plans to update those lists periodically or anything that you've seen?
Well, I will say that we have a new city forester and a second city forester working on that. And I say new in the last few years. The plant list has been updated to what I've shown today, and that's been pretty well expanded from what was available prior. So I think both in terms of diversity and forward-looking, the Des Moines list is in better shape than maybe it was under a prior administrator. But I still think the availability side, which is what we're speaking to here today, is still kind of the crux of the issue. As far as updates here, I don't know. That's city staff information. In the private industry, I just use what is published that I have to follow.
Sure. Trinity, I have one for you. I'm going to try to repeat it as best here. This comes from Eldon. As I continue to explore plantable spaces on private property in heavily urbanized communities, the seemingly less spaces I continue to find, how do we balance pushing private tree planting initiatives and maximizing canopy on public spaces and rights of way? Should we focus on vacant lots, depaving public property, etc.? So I guess the kind of trade-off between where space is available and also where people are and where people use those spaces.
Great question, thank you. Yes, in our area especially, we know 70% of plantable space is private property. And so again, kind of how are we even talking about planting projects? How are we connecting with folks? Because I think there's a lot more spaces available if we're on the same page, and sometimes language is a barrier. I think for us, vacant land has been interesting. Again, where is it on that spectrum? Is it secured land for the foreseeable future, or could it be flipped in 2 years and maybe you've been able to move your community garden, but your trees that have been planted and invested are now wiped off? So I would love to talk more about this. I think for us, we've built out our staff to account for the people component. So at times it is just that outreach table at, like we were at the Peace Party in North Lawndale at Douglas Park a couple of weekends ago, just to connect and say, here we are. Would you consider planting this type of shrubby tree? Because I think still for a lot of folks in the general public, it's like, well, I don't have room for an oak and that's it. Even though they actually do have space for Celtis, you know, a hackberry, or even a smaller shrubby tree. So agreed. I think absolutely there's space. There's potential for private land planting, but are we doing an effective enough job at interpretation and communicating that we have plant material and that we can negotiate and find common ground together? And it takes a lot of staff time and partnership building. I know, for instance, we had a small project in North Lawndale. North Lawndale, we've been there for years. And in one Saturday, a community leader, we walked to 4 different sites that I didn't even consider. One was a pop-up bike maintenance shop on a corner. They loved the pawpaws they got. I would not have considered that a space because I didn't look around the container that was sitting there. So even just one afternoon led to 4 partners I would never have found on my own, even with years of investment. So I think the potential's there. It's just, can you put in the time to invest?
Absolutely. Liana, one back your direction, or at least this came up for you, for the 5 million tree initiative. Can you describe the status of tree supply? Do you find it adequate to meet demand? Do you get all of your trees from DNR nurseries?
Oh, I think right now we're not really getting any of our trees from DNR nurseries. DNR is a partner on this initiative. They're doing their own tremendous planting push. I don't know if someone from DNR is on the call. I think I've seen them as well. But yeah, so they of these 5 million, they have a huge chunk that they are also responsible for planting. Where the Chesapeake Bay Trust is working is the idea of bottom up. We're the ones sort of running a grant program targeting urban underserved areas so that groups can organize their own planting projects. Right. I think DNR, has sort of different goals and a different chunk of the pie and a different approach to how they're tackling it. So I think the approach we're taking right now is to do our best to connect local businesses with local interested parties. And just to piggyback a little bit off what was Trinity was saying, I think from my vantage point about these projects and working with something like municipalities and counties and community groups and the city of Baltimore, these are all really different. They're all really different projects. And it's been interesting, I think, for me in thinking about the portfolio of how we do this work, to recognize, when we work with municipalities and counties, they can take a big picture, cheap approach a lot of times to just grabbing public land and plunking trees in the ground. And there's a lot of benefits from our, pot of money to working with them. They're efficient and they can snatch up all that public space without that much red tape. So definitely, appreciate all of those applicants in our portfolio. Then there's kind of like what Trinity was referring to and other folks that are doing this on the ground, people's backyards, churches, and so in some ways the numbers are lower for the number of trees that you're getting, but that is how you're building community buy-in. That's how you're actually making the cities greener. So, we're thinking about all of those different angles and different costs and benefits when thinking about urban space.
Absolutely. I did see someone chime in. I think for maybe DNR, the Maryland Forest Service hasn't ran into any supply issues between using the state nursery and our contracted nursery, Clear Ridge Nursery, to help with the supply of containerized trees. So one other perspective there. I would be remiss, Trinity, if I didn't ask this, but there was a question wanting to get more information on the development of your tree marketing and outreach materials. I saw a lot of emojis, reactions coming up during those. I think you mentioned a little bit, but could you kind of talk a little bit more about how those were developed and the background there?
Absolutely. So we have a lot of materials in English, Spanish, but it was kind of sitting on a shelf, and if it was asked for, we'd utilize it. Our recent expansion of our Tree Ambassador program, which I'll throw a link in the chat, but it's a great partnership with the City of Chicago, whereby community partners receive contracts, financial support to help increase requests through the city's 311 system. So that's only the Parkway, Park Row on city streets. But not only can they increase requests, but then they get the authority to approve those sites for planting, because unsurprisingly, historically, more tree requests are put in more resourced parts of the city. So working within the outreach networks of these community partners is a no-brainer, right? They already have the trust, so let's financially support them by providing these contracts. And through that process, they were already saying, well, we may focus on community health, but we're going to put together a flyer that connects trees and community health and mental health. So, well, that's phenomenal. So they were already building these outreach materials. And then the question is, well, why aren't we making these multilingual? That we have never had an Arabic piece before. It just made so much sense because we built out that network. So I think that was helpful, realizing we may have a flyer, but you don't need to use our template. Create whatever makes sense to you for how you value trees and connect with your communities. So we have many of those. I'm happy to mail them or to send you the PDFs. But I think if you can connect with community groups and say, okay, can we provide you, can we be a pass-through? Can you help us with the outreaching component? We can bring some expertise, not all, but some expertise in terms of urban forestry. Where can we connect? That's been phenomenal. So I would absolutely advocate for that as much as possible, because then it's their own network, it's their own creativity that's highlighted.
So it sounds like if there was anything to sum this up, collaboration, communication, partnership, fundamental to everything that we're doing across the board here. That I think covers all the questions I saw. If anybody else has any other, feel free to post them in the chat, post them in the Q&A. To our esteemed presenters here, any kind of closing thoughts while we see if anybody else has any comments? Liana, Trinity, Grant, anything that you'd want to add to kind of sum up what you've heard so far? Nothing.